Today we've been going through Mark's gospel, and we're in a series called Heaven Come to Earth. And what we have been seeing is that Mark gets right to it. Mark, there's no genealogies, there's no buildup. The Gospel of Mark gets straight into action, specifically how we put our faith into action. And we recognize that faith is more than just something that we acknowledge. It's something that we do. We are called to put our faith in action. And over the course of this series, we have explored what it looks like to live as though the kingdom of heaven is active here and now. Thus, our series title, Heaven Come to Earth. And we are emphasizing the importance that Jesus is already here with us. And this week, we're going to look at what it means to live as though Jesus is with us in the storms of our life, because He is. So, as many of you know, we had a dry spell there for a little bit, and then, if you remember, last weekend we had quite the torrential downfall. Like last Saturday, last Sunday, we had a lot of rainfall. And I actually have a picture or a video here this is footage from inside the Indianapolis Convention Center. And the Indianapolis Convention Center hosted Gen Con last weekend. Lauren and I went for a couple of days, and we managed to actually leave on Saturday right before this happened. But as you can see, there was so much rain, so much weight of the rain, and probably some structural issues that they're going to have to tend to now, that the water was just pouring into the building. And then there's also a video that I have here of the city streets also couldn't keep up. This is a manhole cover downtown. And you can see this manhole, it almost looks like humorous. This manhole cover is like lifting up because of all the pressure and all of the water that's happening. And these things are like upwards of 300 pounds. So this isn't just something that's really light. So we had quite a bit of storms come through. And some of you may experience that for yourself. Our power went out, just things like that, right? And so when storms come along, what do? We typically panic. You know, people are seeing water come inside a building. We got to figure out, how do we get this problem solved? I had this problem with our house for a number of years. We have a basement, and there's a door that enters into the basement. Every single time a really heavy rainfall would come, we would have about 30 to 60 gallons worth of water that I would have to vacuum out of the basement. And so I spent way too much time doing that, and it was exhausting. And so what did I do? Well, I reached out to my dad for help. I said, hey, we've got to find some solution. And so he helped me come up with a solution. We put a sump pump system right outside the door to my basement. And I am pleased to say that for over the last year, I have not had any flooded waters in my basement. That sump pump system has worked. It pumps all the water out. It's something I definitely clap about. You guys don't have to clap about it, but I clap about it. But here's the thing, right? So there's been zero water in my basement. I've been able to live through some of these rainstorms with some relief. I called my dad, I asked for help, and I received it. And how many of us have lived like that, right? We're exhausted from the storms of life, and we're just hoping for any kind of relief that we can have. So the question that I want to ask you today, the question I have for you today as we begin is this. Do you ever wonder if God really cares about what you're going through? It's not that you don't believe in God, but you wonder if God sees your pain. Does He really care about your struggle? Does He care when your heart is breaking and you're thinking that it sure seems like if He cared, He would do something about this? If you've ever wondered, does God notice? You're not alone. We're going to look at an encounter today where the disciples asked Jesus, they asked the very same question. So today we're going to be in Mark chapter 4, near the end of Mark chapter 4, and the disciples found themselves in an unexpected storm. And it's been said that you're probably, when it comes to storms of life, you're probably in one of three places. See, how many of you can relate with this? Either you are going into a storm, you are in the middle of a storm, or you are coming out of a storm. So that's not very encouraging at first glance, right? There's still storms present in some fashion, but how many of us know this to be true? And I want to speak today to those of you who have especially felt the weight of a stormy season in your life, and that's where the disciples are at too. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pick up this encounter in Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 38. I'm going to read here from my physical Bible. If you have one, I encourage you to follow along. It's going to be from the New Living Translation. You can also use the YouVersion Bible app. The sermon notes for today have that included in there. But we're going to pick up in this story at the end of chapter 4. It says this: As evening came, Jesus said to His disciples, "Let's cross to the other side of the lake." So they took Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although the other boats followed. It's interesting. But soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. Also something interesting to note. The disciples woke him up, shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Silence, be still." Suddenly the wind stopped, and there was a great calm. Then he asked them, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" The disciples were absolutely terrified. "Who is this man?" they asked each other. "Even the wind and waves obey him." So we're going to break this down a little bit further. And first I want us to look at verse 35. It says, "As evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, 'Let's cross the other side of the lake.'" Now, he's talking here, this is the Sea of Galilee. You may recognize this more as the Sea of Galilee. So the Sea of Galilee is about 13 miles long and 8 miles wide. And I have a couple of pictures here this morning to kind of give you an example. This is a little panoramic shot, and you can, if you can see closely enough, you can actually see to the other side, but that's miles across, right? And then I think there's another view here, maybe put a little more into perspective. So there's a good distance to travel across this. And then we're kind of talking about storms today on the Sea of Galilee. This is a picture of a storm taken there, kind of some cloudy skies. You can kind of get an idea, put yourself in the picture of what they're encountering here. And so you see from those pictures that there are mountains on all sides. There are structures on all sides. And what this did was it created, unfortunately, an ideal environment for thunderstorms, fierce and furious storms to take place. And so this was known for very violent storms. And after an exhausting day of ministry, Jesus says something kind of unexpected. He says, "Let's go to the other side." So notice that going to the other side was Jesus' idea, okay? So don't forget that. I want you to keep that in mind for later. The disciples wouldn't have necessarily been happy about this. Where the other side was where the Gentiles were located. And Gentiles, the Jews that the disciples were, they didn't want to associate with the Gentile people because they were seen as pagans, and there were cultural issues that they did not want to be associated with them. But also seas, oceans, things like this were also known to have ancient associations, to have chaos and forces beyond human control. You can't control the sea. You can't control the water, right? So they wouldn't have been excited at Jesus' statement, "Let's go to the other side." But they get in the boat. They follow Jesus in the boat. So then this massive storm happens that we read about. And this reveals to us something very important. And it's that even if you're a Christian, you're not exempt from the storms of life. Even if you are a follower of Jesus, this isn't a guarantee that you're not going to go through hardships in life. Jesus actually tells us this in John 16:33. He says, "Here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows, but take heart because I have overcome the world." There's refuge in Jesus. So the disciples find themselves here, and they're in the middle of this storm, and they were terrified. Like, they're completely desperate. They're crying out to Jesus. So whatever illusion of control they may have felt they had dissipated in this moment. It was completely gone. Just like some of you may be feeling like this morning. There's something that you didn't expect. You're in the middle of a storm right now in your life, and you woke up in the middle of it. So we get to verse 38. It says this, "Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. Then the disciples woke him up, shouting, 'Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?'" So what they're really saying is, you don't care, because if you really did, you would do something about this right now. How many of us have felt like that, right? We've said, "God, like, if you really cared, you would come into my situation. You would help me out right now with this. If you really cared, I wouldn't have lost my job. If you really cared, you wouldn't be allowing my kids to go through this struggle that they're going through at school right now. If you really cared, you wouldn't allow me, you'd help me out of this financial struggle that I'm going through. If you really cared, you'd help me out of this depression that I'm dealing with. If you really cared, my parents wouldn't have gotten divorced. If you really cared, you would do something." And we exclaim these things to God, and we find ourselves in the middle of a storm, and we wonder, does God even care? And there's two things that I want you to remember today about the storms in our life. You're in the storm with his presence, and you're in the storm for his purpose. I want us to notice something very important about what Jesus does during the storm. I think this has probably already stood out. Now I've emphasized it a little bit. He was sleeping. But it doesn't just stop there. We'll make sure to be let known that it says that Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. On a cushion. During this heavy storm, Jesus was sleeping comfortably. He was out cold. So a question I have for the room today is, how many of you would say that you are heavy sleepers? You could just say, you know what, no matter where I'm at, as long as I'm somewhat in a comfortable place, I could take a big fat nap somewhere. Like, that's you. So not as many as I expected. Well, if you raised your hand, I totally relate with you. I am a big-time sleeper. I can sleep as long as I'm comfortable. I can pretty much sleep anywhere. And interestingly enough, over the last decade of our marriage, my wife Lauren, instead of just continually getting frustrated at me for suggesting a movie and then falling asleep right away, she has begun to take multiple pictures of times when I fall asleep. And it's just, I think, partly to humor herself, but also, to maybe use it as blackmail at some point in the future. So I just thought, let's get ahead of that. Let's get ahead of the blackmail. So I'm going to show you guys a couple of examples this morning, probably much to my dismay. So here's me playing a video game a couple years ago. So I was really into that game. And then you guys know that, I'm a big reader, right? And so we were on vacation one time, and I was really into my book. So just really enthralled with the book. I think it was even like a Batman book too. So, but I was out cold with that. But the interesting thing is, she not only has one picture, not only has two pictures, but has over 60 pictures of me sleeping in her phone. And so again, as long as I'm comfortable, I can sleep pretty much anywhere. And so you guys you're laughing, you may be able to relate. Alex is taking a picture because I think he's going to use this later. So that's great. Jana might recommend you now start taking pictures of him. It'll add up over the years. So as long as, like smack down in the middle of the floor, just fall asleep. As long as I take the glasses off, I'm good to go. So I can take a good fat nap. I can sleep really easily as long as I'm comfortable. And I'm going to have the guys go ahead and take this off the screen so no more pictures are taken of me sleeping. So there you go. So I'm going to take that off there. And so why did I show these pictures, right? Well, I can sleep as long as I'm comfortable. And Lauren sometimes will say, how are you sleeping? Is that even comfortable? As long as I'm just tired enough, I can sleep anywhere, right? And preferably not when I'm driving, things like that. But notice there was no driving asleep pictures on there. But the thing I want to emphasize here is that Jesus was sleeping on a cushion. He was at peace. This indicates safety and security. It's pretty hard to fall asleep when you are worried about your surroundings. I mentioned our basement flooding earlier. I had a really hard time. As contrary to what those pictures might indicate, I had a really hard time sleeping when I knew that water could be flooding my basement. I would get sleepless nights because of it. So we see that Jesus is resting and sleeping comfortably while everyone else is so afraid. So the storm is raging, the boat is filling with water, but Jesus is sleeping. And now the disciples, here's the thing, they interpret Jesus' sleep as indifference. Jesus, don't you care? Don't you see what's going on? But here's the thing, Jesus wasn't panicking. The storm was happening around Jesus, but the storm wasn't happening inside of Jesus. And I think there's something very powerful about that. Sometimes faith doesn't mean immediately the storms stop in our lives. Sometimes faith means that I can have peace even while there is a storm going on around me, raging around me. And the disciples were so focused on this storm that they forgot something very important. And it's that Jesus was in the boat with them. We tend to get so caught up in the what of the storm that we forget about the who in the boat. I'm going to say that again. I got a slide here for it. We tend to get so caught up in the what of the storm that we forget about the who in the boat. We get so caught up in seeing everything that's going on around us that we forget who is actually still with us in the midst of our trials, in the midst of our storms of life. And I want to remind you of this today, that the who is always more powerful than the what. The who is always more powerful than the what. Your storm may be real. The pain may be real. The diagnosis may be real. Your broken relationship may be real. But none of those things are greater than the one who is in you and the one who you are with in the boat. So as you look through all of God's word, again and again, we see confirmation that God's presence is near. God's presence is with us. And I've got just a couple of verses up here on the screen this morning. You'll see behind me. And we just see Deuteronomy 31:6. He will never fail you or abandon you. Joshua 1:9. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Psalm 23:4, even when I walk through the darkest valley, I will not be afraid. You are close beside me. And then lastly, the words of Jesus in Matthew 28:20, and be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. So don't be so caught up with the what of the storm that you forget about the who in the boat. Never let the presence of the storm cause you to doubt the presence of God. He's always with you. If someone breaks your heart, he's with you. If you lose your job, he's still with you. If you don't understand why something is happening in your life, he is still with you. If you get a phone call, the one that you never expected to get, he is still with you. If you come home to what feels like an empty apartment, he is still with you. He will never leave you, and he will never forsake you, and he wants to remind you of that this morning. Jesus never said we won't experience storms, but he promised that we will not be alone in the middle of those storms in our life. If you are going through something right now, I just want you to remember that you are in the storm with his presence. And I mentioned earlier about the different types of storms that you may be going through in your life. I want to share with you this morning for a few moments about a recent storm that Lauren and I encountered at the end of last year. And for that, here in just a few moments, I'm going to invite Lauren up to share with me about this situation that we went through. And she's going to share with me, and I'm actually going to hand off a part of this message to her, and then I'll close it out. But we're going to kind of tag team it this morning. But we're going to share about a story of a situation that went on in our life where a storm was present. So Lauren, why don't you come on up and welcome her as she comes. And it's a pleasure. This is, I think, our second time being up here, but not interview style. So you're going to just share with me. But I mentioned, again, earlier that one of the storms that you might be going through in life is a financial storm. And this is a storm that Lauren and I had found ourselves towards the end of last year. And I had sat down and was really looking at our budget and realized that we were spending way more than we were taking in, right? And not only that, but over the course of the last decade, we had accrued some credit card debt, and some of this was our own things that we had a choice on, but some of it was just we went through a season where we were a one-income household for a while, and then Lauren got a job here at the church, and so then things began to iron out. But as more time went by, we realized that we were putting out more in expenses than we were really still making. And so we really had to do through bills, et cetera, just all the stuff. And so we really had to approach the end of last year, and really all these things kind of added up. And we began to reflect on all of this, and we recognized that just something needed to change. We had to kind of reset the course, as it were. And so, Lauren, you want to just kind of share about some of the things that we had to kind of put in practice with that?
Yeah, so this is...
I'll get you on here. My bad. All right, now you're good to go.
I was told I didn't have to press any buttons. So this was something that Clint and I prayed through a lot, and we came to the conclusion, rightfully, that God was going to see us through the season. But what I didn't know is if I needed to take a more active role in that provision that God would provide. So I applied to just 2 jobs. I figured if I didn't get either of those jobs, that's not the move. But I applied within my wheelhouse. So I applied to a bookstore, and I applied to a craft store. For those of you who don't know, I was previously a librarian, and I like to craft. So I got a call back from Michael's, and on that one phone call, I thought they were going to schedule an interview, and I was really nervous because I haven't interviewed in like 10 years. But they just offered me the job over the phone. It was a temporary holiday position, so I think I just sounded like a normal human being, so she felt comfortable just saying, hey, you can have a job, when do you want to start? So I knew that was the move, right? That was God's provision. So I took the job. It was a temporary holiday position, but the store manager within my 3rd shift was like, hey, do you want to stay past the holidays? So I knew that was the move. And so I knew that God was guiding me into this newer space where I got to bring his love into a secular and often stressful environment. I got to hear my coworkers' frustrations. I get to bring them encouragement. I get to serve customers with a smile. And I just get to do my best to treat this low-level job with the best work ethic that I can bring. So even though that I needed this job to supplement our income, I'm also able to be used by God for his purpose within that job.
One of the things that I really felt like God was emphasizing, because we've been through a lot of different, what you would consider storms in our life, maybe some greater than others and some not as much as others, but specifically felt like the Lord was highlighting this specific storm in our life to share, because I believe that there are many here this morning that you may be going through a similar situation, a financial struggle, a financial hardship. And I believe that one of the things that we never stopped being in the midst of this was being generous. We never stopped giving. We were praying about ways that God could still use us in the lack of having finances that we had wanted to have. And I would just say that, we never lost a spirit of generosity through this. And that's not to boast ourselves, but it's just to say that if you are going through a hard time, it can be really easy to try to hold on to everything you have. But I'm reminded of that widow that gave all that she had to God. And we had to put ourselves in a position to say, God, we don't have much. We've been so blessed. And I will not discredit that. We've been so blessed in so many ways. But we recognized that something needed to change. And here's how the equation worked. It wasn't, well, God, you have to come through first. We're just going to sit here. You got to come through. No. It was, we have to step out in faith. We have to trust that Jesus is in the boat with us. And so Lauren made the intents to go out to find a job, and God provided. And oftentimes in life, that's how the equation works. It's not just, well, God, we're going to wait on you. No, it's in faith, in obedience, we step out and then trust God with everything else. And so again, there's just two things to remember when you're in the storm. You're in the storm with his presence, and you're in the storm for his purpose. You can trust him with the purpose of the storm.
Yeah, so like I was saying, with the financial storm we just talked about, it created opportunities for me. So physically, it took me outside of our house and my couch potato status and made me get active. And then relationally, it brought me into a non-spiritual circle to be able to connect and bless a new grouping of people. So looking back at today's passage, you may remember that Jesus was the one who said, let's go to the other side. The disciples weren't in the storm because they were outside of God's will. They were in it because they were following Jesus. And that raises a complicated theological question that I want to acknowledge. Why did he allow the disciples to endure that storm? I could get all of my conjectures for this. I was a lit major, so I'm very used to finding reasoning with things, finding passages to back up my reasoning and all of that. But really the answer is that we don't know. And I don't think that I should pretend or that we should pretend that we do know. God's ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. His reasoning is beyond our capability for reasoning, right? And so what we do know, thanks to Romans 8:28, is that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. So why did God allow this particular storm? We don't know for sure. But what we do see in this story is that they were able to learn something about themselves in that storm that they would not have been able to learn in the safety of the shore. They were in a position that required faith and trust. And they were able to learn something about Jesus that they wouldn't have been able to learn from the safety of the shore while they were in this storm. So maybe that's true for some of us. I don't know why you're going through what you're going through right now. And I definitely won't stand up here and tell you that I do know, and I know exactly why God allowed it. But I do know that God doesn't waste our storms. We may not know why he allowed it, but we can trust him with it. We don't have to understand the storm in order to trust the one who's with us in it. The disciples are learning that lesson while they're in the storm in this passage. So at the end of verse 38, the disciples exclaim to Jesus, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" And Jesus wakes up. When he wakes up, he rebukes the storm and says to the waves, "Silence, be still." Suddenly the wind stopped, and there was a great calm. He was proving that he had authority over the winds and the waves. He didn't say, "Please stop." Like a parent who has to tell their kid for the third time, "Stop it." Or like me with the teens in our youth group, maybe the 6th or 7th time I have to say, "Quit," right? Jesus says, "Stop," right? And because this is Jesus, Immediately, the wind dies down and the waves stop, and there's complete calm. And there's something interesting that happens because Jesus doesn't just stop there. He turns to his disciples and he asks them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And then in verse 41, the disciples were absolutely terrified. "Who is this man?" they asked. "Even the wind and the waves obey him." So if you notice what just happened, at the beginning of the story, they're saying, "Jesus, don't you care?" But by the end, they're saying, "Who is this?" And that's the last question, or that is the question that Mark wants us to ask, right? The miracle isn't about the storm, it's about Jesus. Who is this man? Who speaks to the wind and the waves with authority? Who can stand in the middle of chaos and bring peace? Who is this? This is the one we've been talking about throughout this entire series. The king has arrived. And because the king is sovereign, he has absolute authority over everything. There's something else that I think Peter eventually learned from this experience. So Peter, just like the other disciples, he's freaking out on the boat. But if we think back to the first time meeting Peter in the Gospels, what's his job? He's a fisherman. He's very familiar with this body of water. And in fact, he's probably very familiar with storms on this body of water. So we know that that's not the problem here. The problem is that it's a storm he can't control. And then years later, Peter wrote these words in 1 Peter 5:7. "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." So the picture that Peter is giving us is to throw our anxiety onto God. The word here in the Greek literally means to take what's on you and to throw it onto someone else, to transfer it. So Peter's saying to transfer it over to God, to throw it onto God. God is a big God. He can handle it. As my fellow youth leader Steve likes to say, he has his big boy pants on, right? So whatever it is that burdens you, whatever it is that keeps you awake at night, give it to God. Cast it onto him. If you're afraid for a relationship, give it to God. If you're worried about your children, trust your children to God. If there's a health issue or a career decision, cast that weight onto God. Why? Because God cares for you. Not because your storm isn't real, not because your pain doesn't matter, but because you don't have to carry that weight by yourself. Peter didn't always understand that, but eventually he learned it because Jesus was with him in the storm. And he learned that he could trust Jesus with what he could not control. There was no way he could have learned this lesson if he had just stayed on the safety of the shore. He had to be in this storm with a hands-on experience. So when Jesus spoke, it took just him speaking with authority. Silence. Be still. And the storm was still. I want to encourage you to cast your cares on him. You are not alone. We've all had storms. We've all had challenges. And some of you are in one right now. And maybe you're exhausted from carrying something that you were never meant to carry alone. This is something that I understand incredibly well. I have been diagnosed with generalized anxiety, and I actually take medication for it. But medication doesn't take away opportunities for anxiety, right? It can only mitigate it. Only God can take those anxieties upon himself and relieve me absolutely. Same for anybody else, right? So you need to transfer that care, that anxiety, everything over to God.
That we really want to emphasize too is that you don't have to go through this alone. We're not called to go through this life alone as believers, as followers of Jesus. The disciples were together in the boat with Jesus. So when a storm comes, just remember, you're never alone. Never allow a storm to cause you to doubt the presence of God, as we mentioned earlier. You're in the storm with his presence. You can trust him with the purpose of the storm. You can cast the weight of the storm, whatever it is that you are going through in your life. I am sure by now, many of you here in the room have identified what is the thing in your life that you are struggling with, right? Our God cares about every single detail of your life. He cares for the brokenhearted. He draws near to those who are desperate. And you may be rejected by someone in your own life. But remember, you're never rejected by God. He's always with you. He's always good. And again, you're going to be in one of three places. You're going into a storm, you're in the middle of a storm, or you're coming out of a storm. But just because you are in a stormy season doesn't mean that you are not in the presence of God. The presence of a storm doesn't mean the absence of God, right? So here's the good news. The same Jesus who rebuked the winds, the same Jesus who rebuked the waves, is the very same Jesus, as Lauren said, that has the authority to rebuke the same storms that are going on in your very own life. In the middle of all of the chaos, it's the same Jesus who's right there with you in the middle of the boat. He'll make all things new. Heaven has come to earth, right? He hasn't called us to live this life alone. As I mentioned just a few moments ago, there's an importance of living this life together, living it as a family. We gather in the boat together as a family. A few Sundays ago, talked about the importance of church as a family, that we all come together, that we support one another, that we're there for one another. And we've been talking about the 3 different phases of the storm. And I would say that there are some of you here today that you're maybe coming out of a storm. You've been in a storm, but you're coming out of a storm. And someone else in the room here today may be going into a storm, and that is the very same storm that you just left. And the scriptures tell us that we go through these troubles, we go through these tribulations so that we can help and comfort others too who are going through them. And so maybe as you're talking with someone, you would recognize that they're going through a storm, and it's the very same, similar one that you went through. That's a perfect opportunity to speak into their life, speak life into them, help them navigate the storm, because maybe you didn't have the navigation, but you can help them navigate the storm better. So whatever it is, your anxiety, your brokenness, your rejection, it's a place that you can come and you can meet the grace of God alongside others who are here in your life, because sometimes you're strong enough to believe for someone else. Sometimes it's hard to believe for ourselves, but it's so amazing when we can have other people gather around us who can surround us and encourage us as we go through the storms in our life. So when we gather, we worship, we pray for one another, we carry one another, we cast our cares on Jesus. Why? Because he cares for us in more ways than you can ever imagine, right? He loves us that much. So maybe you are here today and you're in the middle of a storm. And you've been asking this question, the disciples asked, Jesus, don't you care? Don't you see where I'm at? Maybe you've never said it out loud, but you've thought, God, if you cared, why am I still here? Why am I still in this season? If you cared, why hasn't life changed? If you cared, why am I still hurting? And here's the thing, as Lauren mentioned earlier, we don't know why you're in the storm necessarily. Can't give you an easy answer. But sometimes we know this. We don't know why God always allows the storm, but we know what Mark tells us, and it's that Jesus is in the boat with us in the midst of our storms. So as we transition here into our time of ministry towards the end of our time together here this morning, I want you to be thinking about this question. And it's this: what is the storm that you are in right now? What is the storm that you've been carrying that you need to give to Jesus? Maybe it's your marriage. Maybe for some of you, it's your children. Maybe it's your finances. Maybe it's your career. Maybe it's your future. Maybe it's something that no one else knows about, something that you've kept secret that the Lord wants you to bring to light so that he can begin to do a new and healing work in you. And maybe you've been asking, God, don't you care? God, don't you see this? But here's the thing. Today I want you to hear his answer, and it's that I am with you.